This is the man who is responsible for virtually all of the cannabis research. We wouldn't be able to do any of the research that we're doing now if it weren't for him. He first synthesized and isolated the THC, the CBD, the CBG, all of that stuff. We wouldn't know anything about it if it weren't for him. And he's going to come up and talk to us right now. Please, everyone, put your hands together and welcome to the stage the one and only Dr. Raphael Mechoulam.
Thank you for inviting me. I'll try for the next half hour to tell you about a little bit about what went on, what's going on, and what I hope will happen in the next few years. When I started research on cannabis, and that was quite a few years ago, nobody was interested. As a matter of fact, when I asked for a grant, I was told, a grant from NIH in the US, I was told nobody smokes marijuana in the States. They do that in Mexico, we think. If you have something more relevant, kindly let us know. Well, they changed their mind shortly afterwards. Somebody important, maybe a senator, had asked them, what does marijuana do? His son was caught smoking pot, and he wanted to know whether it destroys his mind or something. And they didn't have a single grant. They didn't know anything about marijuana. So they came over to Jerusalem at that time and took the THC we had isolated and elucidated the structure. I think they smuggled it back because they didn't have a license to do that. And for the next few years, most of the work on THC in the States was done with material that was apparently smuggled. Things have changed. Nature, one of the major scientific journals in the world, had a few reviews, and this is from our review, and they put on the first thing a brain from which cannabis comes out. And the reason for that is in the next slide. A few scientists at NIH, and NIH does a lot of research on cannabis nowadays, they wrote that modulating the endocannabinoid activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. And they give a lot of examples. Now, this is a very, very strong statement. I don't know of any other biochemical system that is involved in almost all diseases affecting humans. And while it may not be 100% true, it is close to the truth, and I'll try to explain why and how this happens. But let's start a few years back in my area of the world, Assyria, and we have a lot of documents left from that time. They wrote a lot of them on stone and so on. They used cannabis for essentially all those things that we use cannabis. They said that they had a name, ganzigunu, that's the drug that takes away the mind. It's not a bad definition, but they thought. There was the azalu, of the same plant, which was used as a medicine, apparently for neurological diseases. We're not so sure. And they also use it in their religious rites. So cannabis, as we all know, has been used more or less over the next couple of thousand years. And I'll just give another example. Dr. Russell Reynolds, who was the physician of Queen Victoria in England, used to import cannabis from India. European cannabis was not good enough for him because she had migraines. And he didn't write that in his paper, but it was obvious because she was the only patient he had. For the relief of certain kinds of pain, I believe there is no more useful medicine than cannabis. Then a lot of research started. The middle of this century, we were involved. And I would like to separate the research that has been going on in three phases. The first one is the phytochemistry. namely the chemistry of the plant. Now, most of the people that are involved in cannabis are involved in the phytocannabinoid research on the materials, the compounds that the plant produces. But these are things that we learned, described, tried to investigate about 30 years ago. Since then, things have been happening. First of all, the endocannabinoid research, namely research on the compounds and the cannabinoids that we make, that all mammalians do. And this was more or less completed about 10 years ago. And since then, we have gone into the third phase of cannabinoid research. And this is compounds that are more or less the same as the compounds we produce, but they have different effects. So we have a whole system, a lot of compounds that are very, very much involved in our physiology. And while now, at the moment, most people are interested in cannabidiol and THC, chances are, as it happened with cannabidiol, where it had to wait for about 30 years, chances are that in a meeting like that, in about 15 years of now, most of the talks will be under endogenous cannabinoids and under cannabinoids that have more or less the same structure, but have different effects. So let me try to go into the three phases of research that I'm speaking about. Those of you who haven't forgotten their high school chemistry, these are some of the compounds that are present in cannabis, and we discovered most of them about 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And all of them are more or less the same. The right-hand side is exactly the same. There have been some differences discovered since, but more or less the same. On the left-hand side are the changes, and we have today more than 100 compounds of this type. But the two compounds that most people have been interested in are, of course, cannabidiol, and we described the structure of cannabidiol way back 1963, and we isolated, I believe for the first time in pure form, the active compound, THC, and elucidated the structure, later on synthesized it. So these two compounds have been, of course, the center of interest, and those of you who are involved in cannabis, whether it's in research or in industrial or commercial aspects, deal mostly with these two compounds. But these compounds are not natural products. The natural products are their acids. The plant makes THC acid, cannabidiol acid. These are the compounds that the plant makes. We described them many, many years ago and synthesized them, but we never tested them for a simple reason. These compounds are not stable. The acids break down very easily. So there hasn't been a lot of work on them, contrary to cannabidiol. And the reason is they're not stable. So if somebody does research on them, who knows what they're doing the research on? Is that on the acid, or is it something that the acid has broken down? So very few people were interested in the acids. There are just a few papers, not too many. Now, we thought in the lab that maybe the acids are important by themselves. But, so we had to stabilize them. And by a simple chemical reaction, we stabilized them and made a methyl ester, or the chemists amongst you will know what it is. We made a methyl esters of these compounds, and the methyl esters turned out to be stable, completely stable. So we could analyze, we could identify the activity of these compounds. And we've been working on cannabidiol acid. It turns out that cannabidiol acid is, in those studies that we have undertaken so far, it is more potent than cannabidiol itself. So chances are that slowly to a certain extent, never fully, but slowly, cannabidiol acid as its methyl ester will parallel cannabidiol in its activity, because in many aspects it's much more active. And this is the structure of it. Those of you who remember chemistry will see that it's the methyl ester. And for example, we have already published that this cannabidiol acid, which is most stable, reduces depression-like behavior in 2 models of animal depression. Of course, we cannot go into humans because of regulations. One has to go into animals to a large extent. And even if they are natural products, they have to be investigated for toxicity and other things. But if we assume that most of the things we see in animals, in animal models that parallel human models, then this compound, cannabidiol acid methyl ester, will show activity stronger than CBD itself. We have a publication in press which shows that cannabidiol methyl ester is more potent in pain, lowers pain to a much larger extent. We have seen, as a slide shows, depression. We have seen a few other things, and these will be published over the next few years, and maybe over the next few months. So don't be surprised in cannabidiol methyl ester starts replacing cannabidiol slowly as the natural cannabidiol of importance. It does not cause the THC effects. Another effect that has gained interest is the entourage effect. We found, and it has been, of course, confirmed by many, many people, both in animals and in humans, that some of the effects of THC, of cannabinoids, in quite a few cannabinoids, some of the effects are potentiated by compounds that by themselves have no activity, but they potentiate the activity of THC, and we call this the entourage effect. And although it doesn't, one does not see that in all effects of THC or all effects cannabinoids, many of the effects have this entourage effect. So things become very complicated. If somebody wants to put THC as an extract or CBD as an extract, one has also to know what are the compounds that are present there together with these 2 compounds. So we can have a sample that contains a certain percentage of these central compounds, and another one that has the same percentage, and yet the activities are somewhat different. So we shall have to develop analytical procedures, at least for most of the compounds that are present in cannabis, in order to explain the activity, and not to sell compounds with a certain percentage and another compound, another extract with the same percentage, and yet they are quite different. We have to show ultimately what are the rest of the compounds, or some of the rest of the compounds that are around. So this is the entourage effect, and we have to take into account entourage effects all the time. Now, okay, a few words about THC. Most of you are aware of that. Has to do with pain, nausea, vomiting, sleep, anxiety, appetite, quite a few other things. And THC, as you know, has been approved by many of the bodies in many countries, in the US and other countries. And it is an approved drug, a minor drug. And the reason for that is that people prefer the extract, possibly because of the entourage effect, rather than THC itself. So THC has been on the market, not a major drug. I've been told that it's sold in the US between $100 and $200 million, which for a major drug is nowhere there. One thing that people have not investigated very thoroughly is depression, and THC shows significant antidepressant effect, but the other compounds, like cannabichromine, for example, show the same effect, a little bit at higher doses, but they show the same effect. So we should know what's being sold exactly, whether it's THC, whether it's cannabichromine, or whether it's other things. Now, cannabichromine may be not as active as THC, but it doesn't cause the side effects. So maybe people will be selling cannabichromine because of the lack of side effects that people in pain don't want. And we have published that THC is also pretty important in post-trauma. We know that post-trauma patients take cannabis in order to lower the effects of post-trauma. We went ahead and did a clinical trial and found that indeed low amounts of THC, which do not cause the high, may help post-trauma patients. We had a group of about 12 patients, a few soldiers, a few women that had been raped, a few patients that had PTSD because of car accident. And we found that in essentially all the effects of post-trauma, THC helped. The effect didn't disappear. They were easier to go around with. And the best effect was on sleep. Post-trauma patients do not sleep well. They are afraid to go to sleep because in the middle of the night they wake up with the trauma happening again. And that's why they are afraid to go to sleep and they don't sleep well. Well, we found that with THC, low doses, they sleep much better. And this is one of the reasons post-trauma patients do take cannabis. But let's go on with the cannabidiol actions. And of course, I'll start with epilepsy because it has been approved. Now, this is a paper you can see that we published 1980, which is almost 40 years ago. We found, this was in collaboration with colleagues and friends in South America, we found in animals, as was previously noted in the literature for 2,000 years, that cannabis works on epilepsy. So we looked at cannabidiol, first in animals and then went to humans. We did that on about 12 patients or 15 patients, and we saw that in most of the patients it affected positively the epilepsy. Most of them had very few attacks, a few had much less attacks, and only one was not affected. So we published that, and we thought that maybe it will be used, that people will do larger trials, and it will be introduced as a drug. Nothing happened for almost 30 years. Then parents in the US discovered that plants containing large amounts of cannabidiol help with the epilepsy of their children, and children sometimes have terrible epilepsies, 20 attacks a day or something. But the cannabidiol helped, and they were going to one of the states where when cannabis was legal. And maybe some of them had known about the paper. Now, why did we have to wait for 30 years? Thousands of children, thousands of patients could have been helped, definitely children. But because of possibly legal problems, possibly of other problems, nobody had taken up the information that was in the literature. Now, once parents saw that cannabis with a lot of cannabidiol helps, there was pressure on the US authorities, and a big trial was approved. In the US, it's very difficult to get clinical trials with cannabis, but this one was approved because of social pressure. And it turned out to be extremely positive. It paralleled what we did, but it was done in children. It was done in hundreds of children. And now cannabidiol, under the name of Epidiolex, is approved as a drug in epilepsy. Why wasn't that done 30 years ago? We had found that cannabidiol is active in autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune diseases are diseases in which the body, for many reasons, some of which we don't know, attacks itself. And there are a lot of autoimmune diseases. Now, a disease which is close to the autoimmune diseases is the graft versus host disease. Sometimes in cancer patients, the bone marrow has to be replaced. And when the bone marrow is replaced, the body doesn't like it, and it may attack it. And the bone marrow itself may attack the body. And the patient suffers, sometimes suffers very, very much. But this is essentially autoimmune reaction. So a colleague of mine, Dr. Yeshurun, went ahead, it's a collaboration we had, went ahead and started giving pure cannabidiol to patients with graft versus host disease. And he was very glad to note that, yes, in most of the patients which had a relatively mild disease, and this is called a 2 to 4 grade disease, 40% previously had graft versus host disease. When they were taking cannabidiol, this went down to 12%. Those that had real bad disease, GVHD, which was previously 10%, and a few even died, went down to about 5%. So here we have a drug, cannabidiol, which can be used in this anti-cancer treatment. And it is being developed as a drug. A company is going ahead with the CBD and GVHD, and I think it's now in phase 2, and chances are it will be in phase 3 shortly. So let's hope that within a year or two we shall have a drug, CBD, as a potent GVH drug, which there are no other drugs at the moment. Now, schizophrenia. Now, I mentioned that because it was developed mostly in Germany. We had shown, again with my good friends in South America, that it helps in a very few patients. We published that many years ago. We had given CBD to a young woman who had terrible schizophrenia, and it helped her over 3 months. And Leverke in Germany decided to go ahead, and he made a relatively larger trial, and he gave it to patients that nothing was helping them anymore, schizophrenic patients, and he found that CBD was an excellent drug. He compared it to one of the drugs that are already being used, amisulpride, and this drug, which is a good drug, has side effects. Now, cannabidiol and the drugs that are already being used have the same activity, except that cannabidiol causes no side effects. Many schizophrenic patients don't want to take the anti-schizophrenic drugs because of the side effects. Chances are that cannabidiol can replace these drugs. Unfortunately, the amounts of cannabidiol are very high, about 800 milligrams per day. That's quite high. But maybe, just maybe, with the new drugs that I was telling you about, methyl ester, we can go down to much lower doses. So these are developments that we shall see in the future. But I hope that even now, schizophrenic patients will be administered cannabidiol. The amounts are very high, about 800 milligrams a day, but it is definitely worth it. And chances are that cannabidiol will be approved as a drug against schizophrenia. I'm not sure that it is approved in any country at the moment. I know that in Israel it is being discussed. We're having a meeting next week with the heads of the Ministry of Health, and I'm trying to push cannabidiol as an anti-schizophrenic drug. This is what I was telling you about, that cannabidiol was compared to amisulpride, and it also causes some of the, it's better in some of the side effects. It causes less weight gain, it causes no changes in estrogen and testosterone, and it causes a lot of the different effect that the unpleasant effect that present drug, amisulpride, is causing. So we have probably, I believe that we shall have cannabidiol as anti-schizophrenic drug within the next year or two. And these are some of the symptoms that the present drug causes. It may cause muscle spasms, it can cause slowness of movement, tremor, and some other unpleasant types. Now, another disease that we've been working on is diabetes type 1. Again, it is an autoimmune disease. The body, for reasons that we don't know, attacks those cells that produce insulin. And the patient, usually that's seen in children, so diabetes type 1 is a pediatric disease. These children don't have enough insulin and they're sick, sometimes very sick. We found that cannabidiol is extremely helpful, and in animals at least, we have not done that in humans, we don't have the permits yet. We have seen that in animals, only 5% of the cells that produce insulin remain intact. Those that are given cannabidiol, we see that 77% of the cells that produce insulin remain intact. So here we have a major improvement. And unfortunately, although we published that quite a few years ago, this disease has not been, or this treatment for the disease has not been looked into in humans. Why? We can't do everything, and apparently very few people are interested, although it is a major disease and a disease from which quite a few, particularly children, suffer. So if any of you has enough pressure in your countries to have a diabetes type 1 clinical trial with pure cannabidiol, go ahead. Now, almost all drugs from natural products are sold not as the drugs themselves, but as a derivative. And the reason for that the reasons are quite a lot. First of all, on the natural product, the patent is not very strong. And by making a small derivative, of chemical derivative, usually one can get more potent compounds and compounds that are better in many ways. For example, today you cannot buy insulin, you cannot buy penicillin as such. You can buy a derivative of penicillin in a drugstore. Or let's go into cortisone, another major hormone. You cannot buy cortisone in a drugstore. You can buy derivatives of cortisone. And these derivatives may be sold about $5 or $6 billion a year. So chances are that cannabidiol, within the next few years, will be on the market as a derivative, not as cannabidiol itself, but as a derivative. And here is a derivative that we have published, and a company is developing it. And this derivative parallels the activity of CBD, but is somewhat more potent. So chances are that in the near future, or the distant future, we shall have both cannabidiol and cannabidiol derivatives. Now, let me go into the phase 2 of cannabis research. And this is the compound that we make ourselves. For many reasons, and some of the reasons we brought into the literature, it was obvious that cannabidiol acts on something in the body, specifically, which may be a receptor. And so a group in the US found a receptor, protein in the body that THC binds to it, and it starts all the reactions. So, but we don't have receptors because there is a plant out there. We have receptors because we make compounds that will stimulate these receptors. So we went ahead looking for compounds, and this receptor was found in all these places that you can see called basal ganglia, all these places that have to do with movement control and movement coordination and cognitive function, all these things that people know happen with THC. So this receptor was obviously important and central. So we started looking for the compounds that we make or animals make that activated parallel the activity of THC. And after quite a lot of work, we found two compounds. One of them we call anandamide, and the second one is known as 2-AG, which are chemically completely different, but have the same activity and the same activity as THC. You can see, and if you've forgotten your chemistry, that these two compounds, anandamide and 2-AG, which animals produce and we produce, completely different chemically from THC. But they have the same physical properties. They are lipid. They dissolve only in lipids, not in water. They bind to the same receptor and so on. So anandamide and 2-AG have been discussed widely in the literature. There's thousands of publications on anandamide and 2-AG, and these compounds are central in the so-called endocannabinoid system, which consists of the receptors, there are two of them, the two compounds, the enzymes that break down these compounds or help synthesize them, and of course THC and cannabidiol. So there has been a lot of theoretical work or work that has very little relation to marketing and so on for a simple reason. Although we discovered anandamide and a little bit later 2-AG, anandamide has never been administered to a human. And again, because of mostly legal reasons. It's not toxic. It's made by the body. If we compare that with, let's say, insulin was discovered 100 years ago and in Canada. And within 6 months, it became a drug, or within a year, it became a drug. A very useful drug. Even today, people use insulin as a drug, more or less. Now, why anandamide, which has outstanding medical properties, never been used? Legal reasons, patent problems, and so on. So this is strange because we know in schizophrenia, for example, when cannabidiol is administered, the main effect is that anandamide concentrations go up. And if anandamide concentrations go up, maybe it is anandamide that's helping, not cannabidiol, but anandamide indirectly. There are many other diseases that anandamide has to do. So it's unbelievable, but it has never been given to a human. And now, in animals, it has been looked at the endocannabinoid system, and it has been found to be involved in a huge number of physiological effects, starting from anxiety and appetite, and so on and so forth. We can see the mood, movement, stress. If I were to prepare a new slide, this is a slide of 2 years ago, I would have twice as many physiological things happening. So it is extremely important, and chances are that at some point, anandamide or a derivative of anandamide will become a drug. I'll give you just two examples. Neuroprotection. We tried with a colleague of ours to see whether these compounds are involved in neuroprotection. And we tried that, of course, on animals. I don't believe that any of our friends would have volunteered to have some kind of brain attack, as we did on poor mice. And we saw that after such a, when they were given a small attack on the brain, not a very strong one, as a matter of fact, within a couple of weeks they went back to be completely normal. We saw that 2-AG, one of the two endocannabinoids, goes up tremendously. Now, is that because the brain being damaged didn't know what was doing? Was that some kind of a protection? So we synthesized a lot of 2-AG and gave to animals and compared to animals that not given 2-AG, and we saw that yes, the 2-AG, one of the endocannabinoids, is a potent protectant. If we gave that to the people that know how to look at these things in the brain, and we saw that in the controls we had a certain amount of damage, the white part that you see, those that were given 2-AG, the endocannabinoid, had 50% less. So probably at some point, 2-AG will be developed as a drug against brain damage. There is no drug at the moment. Quite a few people get that kind of damage, and there is nothing to do with that. I mean, there are no drugs available today that can help. Now, one thing that has been found quite recently, again in South America, is that CB1 receptors are not only known to lower anxiety, but quite a few of the drugs that we use today, and we are not sure of their activity, or we have wrongly assigned some of their activity, is due to the cannabinoid system. And there is, for example, Xanax, alprazolam, which is an anti-anxiety drug, well-known, widely used. Actually, it works through the cannabinoid receptors. So if this is the case, chances are that people will develop additional drugs in this respect. Now, I mentioned that there are two receptors, CB1 and CB2. The activation of the CB1 receptor causes the well-known THC activities, the high and so on. The second one, the CB2, does not cause it. It is a protective receptor. And I know some companies, in Switzerland at least one company, is developing drugs based on the second receptor that does not cause these side effects which are not of importance to a pharmaceutical company. They act only on the CB2 receptor, not on the CB1 receptor. And acting only in the CB2 receptor, with compounds that we have made or compounds that the companies have made, these CB2 receptors are involved in a huge number of protective mechanisms in heart problems, in atherosclerosis, in pain, neurodegenerative diseases. Again, if these companies succeed in producing compounds and evaluating them, chances are that we shall have drugs that are not CBD, are not THC, but are based on CB2 receptors. But I don't have the time to go into that. We can speak for a long time. Here are compounds that are specifically acting on the CB2. And so this is a few words on the endogenous cannabinoid system, which is phase 2 of research. At present, we are working on phase 3. And phase 3 research is something else entirely. I mentioned anandamide. Those of you who are chemists will see that anandamide is a rather simple compound. It is a fatty acid bound to an amino acid. We have about 20 fatty acids and about 20 amino acids in our body. Now, our body is lazy. If it knows how to make anandamide, taking a fatty acid and binding it to an amino acid, why not take the other fatty acids and the other amino acids and make additional compounds, make use of them so it won't have to spend energy. It already has the machinery to do that. And yes, we found that this is exactly what's happening. How did we go into that? We saw that in brain injury, there is brain injury, part of the brain injury causes effects on all kinds of transmitters, glutamate, and so on, and ultimately it causes neuronal and cell death. But, and these are the things I was telling you previously, but it also causes, brain injury can cause vasoconstriction. The blood vessels constrict. This is not healthy. So the body tries to prevent that. And we saw that cannabis, extract of cannabis, can help with that. And if we take the brain of another animal and extract it and give it, it also helps with the vasoconstriction. So there is a compound in our body which helps with vasoconstriction. And so we went ahead looking for that. We didn't know that it has to do anything that with endocannabinoids. We just went ahead looking for the compounds. It could be anything. And after quite a lot of work, we found that our body helps with vasodilation by making a third compound, like anandamide. But it does not cause any of the effects of anandamide. It just helps with a vasoconstriction. It dilates the blood vessels. So this is something that our body makes in order to prevent vasoconstriction, which is due to brain damage. If we block this system, the brain damage is much higher. So here we have a drug, a cannabinoid-like drug, which has to do with vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and again, I repeat myself all the time, maybe it will be used as a drug. But this is not the only thing. Another thing that happens is with bones. Again, this was a research project which we didn't think has anything to do with cannabinoids. The background of our work on bones was that it was known that women after the age of 50, 55, when all the hormones are changed and when all the hormones don't work the way they did previously, women should have a lot of osteoporosis, which they do, most of them. But the osteoporosis in women in the Mediterranean region is much lower than the osteoporosis in the north, in Norway, let's say, or even in Berlin. Now, we thought, what's the reason? And there is a suggestion in the literature that this is because of the olive oil that's being used around the Mediterranean. So we looked at the olive oil and it didn't do anything, but maybe we said it's a derivative. It's a derivative that our body makes, and we worked quite a lot on this project. And ultimately we found that, yes, our body makes a compound which is closely related chemically to anandamide, which again is strange. We didn't expect anything like that. We thought that that's a completely different research problem. But we saw that our body, women's body of course, produces a compound closely related to anandamide, and it blocks osteoporosis. Not completely, but it blocks it very well indeed. And doing that, it helps. Again, it's not an endocannabinoid, it is not a THC, but it is closely related. So, again, a company has taken up this compound, which is, again, a fatty acid bound to an amino acid, closely related to anandamide, and when given to mice, works extremely well. Well, we're not mice. I hope that it will work in humans. When it is given, I believe that it will. And I will just show you one slide. Most of the drugs that we use to get osteoporosis nowadays, most of the drugs block the destruction of the bones. They don't cause the bones to be built up again. In this case, the compound that animals make, that we make, which is closely related to anandamide, it is part of the endocannabinoid system. This compound not only blocks the destruction of the bones, but even helps the bones grow up. You can see in this slide, the first green thing is what the bones are at the moment. After the ovaries and everything else has been taken out of the mice in order to parallel what happens in women after the age of 55. The bones of the animals went down, and it's the red thing we see. It has gone down, and they have strong and potent osteoporosis. And when we start, after 40, 45 days, when we see this, when we start giving them the new cannabinoid-like compound, we see that the bones not only are not destructed anymore, they even go up and are being remodeled again, rebuilt again. So here we have a typical example of the phase 3 of cannabinoid work, namely fatty acids bound to amino acids, like in anandamide, without compounds, without psychoactivity. So here we have an example of what I'm talking about. And I would like now to summarize. Oh, another thing that we're actually working at the moment, it's nicotine addiction. We get addicted to many compounds, to many things, including drugs, opium, cocaine, nicotine. Now, our body looks at nicotine, at any addiction, certainly also to nicotine addiction, as a disease. If it's a disease, then the body will try to block the disease. How does it block it? Well, we didn't know, but we thought that maybe our body makes compounds that try to block the disease. I would not go into details there. It was a long story. We, in this case, was a group of 4 research labs. Ours came up with a suggestion, good friends in the US, at Richmond, Virginia, good friends in Canada, and good friends in Italy. We sit together, drink a lot of coffee together, and discuss how to go ahead. And together we went ahead looking how does the body fight nicotine addiction. And we found that in a certain place in the brain, a compound is formed which, again, is a fatty acid bound to amino acid. Strangely enough, when we started, we didn't have the foggiest idea that this is going to happen. Again, we have an endocannabinoid-like situation, and this compound blocks an effect which is one of the models. It's called conditioned place preference. It blocks one of the models of addiction. What is conditional place preference? You put a mouse, the center, on one hand you have food with nicotine, the other hand food, on the other side food without nicotine. At the beginning they go 50% here, 50% there. Then slowly they get addicted and go only to the food that has addiction, and that's called conditioned place preference. And we could block not only the model, the conditioned place preference, but we could block even the withdrawal symptoms when people or mice are not given nicotine anymore and they're addicted. They show some kind of anxiety. Well, that's what happened. So it was tried also in morphine. It doesn't block morphine addiction, but it blocks the withdrawal symptoms. So if it turns out to do the same in humans, we can maybe block withdrawal symptoms of nicotine, withdrawal symptoms of morphine, which is a great thing. After all, only in the US, there are about 65,000 people that die of morphine overdose. So maybe we can help many of those. So just as a summary, there are 3 phases of cannabinoid research. One of them has to do with the plants, THC, CBD, possibly other compounds. The other one has to do with the endocannabinoids, which are involved in a large number of physiological processes. And within that story, there are the CB2 receptors, which are specific for many diseases and do not cause the side effects. And the third one is a huge number, almost 100 compounds that our body makes, and we know about the activity of about 5 or 10, and chances are they'll see many more. So cannabinoids in the future, in research, in medicine, certainly in all the other commercial or non-commercial aspect, we shall be seeing people going ahead with plant cannabinoids, the main thing that's being done today, endogenous cannabinoids, which will probably be developed within the next few years, and anandamide-like compounds, which will take a little bit more. And I want to thank many of my collaborators quite a lot. All this work is being done with collaborators. No a lab can do everything alone. These things have to be done in collaboration, and these are collaborators in Israel and a lot of collaborators abroad. We meet with some of them, and we discuss problems from many different sides of science, and hopefully we have succeeded in doing some things that may be of importance, and maybe we'll do some things in the future as well. Thank you.
Yes, yes. One more time, Dr. Mechoulam. Man, that was worth the price of admission already. Maybe we have time for one question, maybe two. Please be brief. We're running over already, so please, no stories, just questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Mechoulam. I'm Chinanit Koltai from Israel. My question is, to the best of my knowledge, only THC was shown to bind CB1 and CB2 with high affinity. What do you think is the mode of action of the other phytocannabinoids which may not bind cannabinoid receptors with high affinity?
We have information about the mode of action of cannabidiol. It does not bind to the receptors. It binds very weakly as an antagonist, but not significant. It does quite a lot of other things, and it affects a lot of other systems. And it is strange that we see no side effect. It affects, and I will not go into the whole list of mechanisms that are known for CB2. It does all these things, and I'm surprised that we don't see any side effect. But the fact is that it doesn't. Why it does so many things, I'm not so sure. One thing that people are looking at the moment, and it may be very basic, and this is one of the few compounds that acts on DNA itself. Mostly with drugs, we see effects on the symptoms. Here has been found that CBD acts on DNA. It changes the activity of the specific DNA. So maybe, just maybe, if there is a disease of some kind, and this is due to DNA producing something too much of it, maybe what CBD does, it goes to that particular part of the DNA and blocks it. Maybe there has been some work in Italy which shows that it acts in psoriasis, I believe they looked into. It acts on the DNA. So chances are that this is the main activity. But again, this is something that people are working on at the moment.
One more right here. Stand up. Hold it close to your face.
Hi, Anuja Siwakoti from Medifarm Labs, Canada. Thank you so much for that interesting talk.
I'm sorry, I can't. Can you speak
Even
slowly
closer.
and louder?
Okay. Does CBD's two different stereoisomer have different effects in the body?
CBD is a compound, which I didn't go into it, which has a mirror image. There's the plus CBD and the minus CBD. The natural product is the minus CBD. Very little work has been done on the mirror image. And the plus CBD, surprisingly, some work that we did, I think 30 years ago, we found that some of the effects of the minus CBD are also seen with the plus CBD, which is unusual. But as I said, since then, nothing has been done on the plus CBD. The plus THC also does not cause the side effects, does not cause the effects of THC, but it has been shown that it lowers brain damage.
Thank you very much. One more time, Dr. Mechoulam.
Thank you. Sorry.
That was amazing.